Hello again, Challenger class at Harvard Avenue Christian Church in Tulsa. It's good to be with you again. I am Jeff Gill, and this is the second part of two sessions about the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, a religious tradition which we share, me here in Granville, Ohio, you there in Oklahoma, and the arc, or as was once called the Disciples' Crescent, which curves roughly from where I'm speaking to you now to where you all are listening to this video on down into Texas, that was and still is in many ways the heart of our branch, at least, of the Restoration Movement, the Stone Campbell movement, the movement for Christian unity, which gave birth to a very particular way of opening the communion table and extending the invitation to discipleship behind the example and under the authority of Jesus Christ, using Scripture as our basis. That's what joins us together. And there are quite a few churches, although perhaps not as many as there once were. And there's a whole nother discussion perhaps we could share about the history and the reasons for the decline that we've seen, and what it means for the future that I believe we still have, or I would be teaching this history for Phillips Theological Seminary and their CMLT program, and for congregations in Sunday school classes like yours. So let me pick up where I left off, and hopefully not too many people are coming for the first time this week, but I did make a comment towards the end of the first part, last talk or lecture, about the fact that Alexander Campbell had as his base of operations for most of his time in ministry and leadership in this movement, and in truth, Barton Stone, who passes away in Hannibal, Missouri. There's an interesting set of Mark Twain connections there, which we don't have time for, but Barton Stone is later brought back to Jacksonville, Illinois, where he'd moved to from Cane Ridge, but in fact, he was then further on taken back home, if you will, to Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and it's the Cane Ridge Meeting House. Now you're seeing from the inside, as my background here, doors and the steps up to the balcony, which we'll get to in a moment, but just outside of the building that's protecting this 1796 log building, Barton Stone is buried. Anyhow, Barton Stone passes on, and for the remaining 20 years of what we can call the Founders era, Alexander Campbell really was the preeminent voice that shaped and guided and pushed out really literally around the world, but especially across the United States and Canada, this movement of not the only Christians, but Christians only. And as Campbell liked to say, looking for Bible names for Bible things, since that was the one authority that Campbell, and this did give him kinship with Stone, he wanted to look to scriptural authority and not necessarily to creeds and catechisms, as he would have said in his time, man-made restrictions, especially on who can be baptized and emphatically on who could receive communion. Well, what I alluded to, and I want to expand on to kind of set up this second and last portion of my quick overview of Disciples of Christ history, is that Alexander Campbell ultimately marries and moves to Upper Buffalo, Virginia. Now, this is currently part of the northern panhandle of West Virginia, between Wheeling, West Virginia, and Pittsburgh. It kind of sticks up in the map between Ohio and Pennsylvania, gave them good access to the northeast corner of the Northwest Territory and what would become the state of Ohio. But Alexander Campbell, to spread his message of Christian unity and an open table as the basis for expanding discipleship on the American frontier, he found that buying a small printing press and learning how to operate it, and ultimately getting a bigger one and hiring people to run it for him, this was, if you go to Bethany, West Virginia today, it all looks kind of quaint. It all looks very historical. But for Campbell's time and place in the 1820s and 1830s, for him to purchase a printing press and operate it as a private citizen to extend a message was the equivalent of, in the last couple decades, folks like you and me or Pastor David getting a web page going, posting Instagrams, using TikTok, perhaps even. So using the high technology of his day, Campbell printed first the Christian Baptist, later his magazine became known as the Millennial Harbinger. But this monthly periodical was the heart and the anchor and really the structure of the Stone Campbell movement, or what Campbell preferred to refer to as the disciples of Christ. It was Stone who preferred the simply Christian church label. And it's part of our history that many of our churches are whatever the town name, street name, perhaps a water course name, but it's the blank Christian church, parentheses, disciples of Christ. So we have both aspects of our history embedded in that kind of awkward nomenclature. As I said at the close of our last session, it's also a reflection of, well, what Alexander Campbell firmly established through the 1840s to the Civil War and his death in 1866, which is a reluctance to make hard decisions. So rather than deciding which really was better and more biblical, Christian church or disciples of Christ, we just said, we'll use both. I'll come back to that. But also, Campbell had his printing press to share his message and his interpretation and his understanding of how Christian unity was a possibility using the New Testament as the simple basis for a very basic level of church organization, not the elaborate hierarchies that he saw at work in the Presbyterian and Methodist churches that were kind of the most common other forms of Christianity on the American frontier. Well, he could print them, but then to get them delivered was another subject and another expense. And this is where Campbell got the idea of applying to become the postmaster of Upper Buffalo, Virginia, because in that time and place, postmasters got what is called franking privileges or free postage. If you did the work, you got the benefit, and the benefit was free postage. So Campbell applied to become postmaster of Upper Buffalo. And he heard back from the postmaster for the state of Virginia, which, remember, it's Virginia until 1863. Campbell's told, we've got too many buffaloes in Virginia. We got Buffalo and New Buffalo and Upper Buffalo and West Buffalo, and it's just too much. Name your post office, and by extension, effectively, your community, something different. So he thought, I suspect not for very long, and then he wrote back. And since he and his family were the primary landowners and most of the wealth, to be perfectly blunt about it, in that area, I doubt if he consulted anyone else. He just said, Mr. Postmaster in Richmond, this post office will be known as Bethany henceforth. Later on, when people ask, why did you change the name of the town from Upper Buffalo to Bethany? He said, why? Because when you read the New Testament, Bethany is where the friends of Jesus live. And he's strictly, literally correct. Lazarus, Mary and Martha, they lived in Bethany. So the name has stuck. Now, when Campbell was using these franking privileges to send out the Millennial Harbinger, he could send mail. He also received mail. And this is how he became the authority, the structure for a very unstructured tradition. And until, again, as I said, his death in 1866, Campbell determined what could be discussed and what couldn't be discussed. He decided that talking about abolition and ending slavery would alienate so many churches in the South and would become such an obstacle to sharing the simple restored gospel of Jesus Christ that he just wouldn't allow discussion. And so we didn't discuss it. We didn't split over it. Well, not before the Civil War, but I would argue in some ways our split might have become deeper and more lasting because of the fact that we didn't have it out. So I say that to commend Campbell in his role, but also to critique how perhaps some of these historical influences are still with us in a tendency to avoid hard discussions and difficult decisions. But it is true that he would pretty much let anything else be discussed. And in the early days of the disciples of Christ, all kinds of things like even weekly communion or the credentials and qualifications for an elder, and certainly what it meant to have a preaching and teaching elder who was a compensated member of the eldership, what we'd call a minister or a preacher today. There were a lot of different opinions in the early church, and I'll note all too briefly here, it is an interesting quirk of church history, but very illuminating if you spend the time to dig into it, that there's a fellow named Joseph Smith Jr., who apparently heard quite a bit about this restored gospel and seems to have been influenced greatly by some of what Campbell was writing and publishing. And he lived in New York State. And you might know him better as Prophet Joseph Smith and the leader of what becomes known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, which they prefer we not use, but I know you're familiar with the tag. Anyhow, if you look at the very earliest documents of what Joseph Smith at first simply called the Church of Christ, you will be shocked to see how close they are to some of our earliest documents in the 1820s and 1830s. And in fact, when people ask me, so what was early disciples' worship like? I say, depending on the audience, and if I think they can handle hearing it, if you've never visited a Latter-day Saints Sunday morning meeting house service, you might just want to go as a guest and sit and listen, and you will see that there's a great deal about what the Latter-day Saints did, especially in their first years, that's very similar to how our church got rolling. And we clearly went in different directions, but we share some common roots. And in fact, many of the first and most significant leaders in Latter-day Saints were directly, poached or preached out of the disciples into Joseph Smith's church up in Kirtland, Ohio, which then later moved on to Nauvoo, and after Smith's death, moves on to Utah. That's a digression for another day, but the simple gospel had competition, and certainly people like Peter Cartwright with the Methodist Church, and there were Presbyterian evangelists and others saying, no, you can't have such a loose structure of your church, and you can't just be so free and easy about who you invite to baptism and to communion. So Campbell, Alexander Campbell, his father, preached on into great old age into the 1850s, but still it was Alexander, and largely through his publishing, he becomes the person who shapes the debate and ultimately determines some of our still existing norms, that we have communion each Sunday, that disciples of Christ still tends to be the primary simple name that we use, and we don't object to people using it, that's for sure. And at least for a very long time, even after Campbell's death, the role of periodicals in how we discussed what we did and didn't agree on, and how we carried out the debates that we gave ourselves permission to have with each other, it became said in the generations after Campbell's passing that the disciples of Christ don't have bishops, they have editors. That was true. The editors of all the many publications that sprang up after Campbell's passing became, in a sense, like bishops in other traditions, leading factions and carrying out debates and discussions. And in that next era of our church's life, the biggest debate, and one that led, I guess you could say, to our biggest split, was over cooperative missions. Could congregations pool and share together offerings to do what we still to some degree call cooperative missions, or were missionary efforts up to and including orphanages and colleges to be provided for individually, congregation by congregation, totally independently in nature, a much more, if you will, market-based system. The debate between the independents and the cooperatives echoes on into the 20th century, and as I said, becomes the source of some of our biggest divisions between the independent Christian churches and the disciples of Christ, who picked up where Alexander Campbell went in his last couple decades of writing and editing and preaching. And we formed cooperative associations, including state societies. And that's where our great distinctive, which looks similar to how other churches do things, but isn't quite, if you lift the hood, are state missionary societies like the Ohio Christian Missionary Society, or for a long time, the OCMS, or confusingly, the Oklahoma Christian Missionary Society, OCMS. Well, all of them became state missionary societies, and each with a totally independent relationship. Remember, that tension's still there even on the cooperative level, with the United Christian Missionary Society, which began after 1849 to send missionaries outside of the United States and Canada to share the gospel, as other groups like the Congregationalists and Baptists and Presbyterians and such had been doing for some time. Well, these state societies we now know as regions, and the corresponding secretary, or later executive secretary, the secretaries of the state societies, became what we call regional ministers. And those state conventions become regional assemblies, just as the International Convention of the United Christian Missionary Society ultimately becomes the General Assembly. So we go from the founders, Barton Stone, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, and Walter Scott, whom I'm not going to give too much justice to, I fear, but our first great evangelist and planted churches up and down the Ohio River Valley. Those four founders, upon their passing, we move into an era that's literally the era of the editors. But the era of the editors is followed basically by an era of agencies, especially as I'm talking about the disciples of Christ, because both our state societies start to develop some vitality and build trust from congregations established in the Restoration Movement tradition. But they're also what we now call general units, but the independent agencies of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ are still to this day, and this is very different than how it operates in other Protestant denominational structures. Our general minister and president doesn't control them. They are indeed still within the disciples, totally independent. The pension fund, independent. Disciples Church Extension, independent. Even in a very real sense, our disciples' home missions and global ministries, which we've shared now for some decades with the United Church of Christ global ministries. Each of these are not controlled by even the General Assembly, let alone our executive officers, but they are independent. So independence, or autonomy, has been referred to both as the great blessing, but also the Achilles heel of our tradition. Because at each change in our development, again, from the founders era to the editors era to the rise of the agencies, and then ultimately an era I would say we're still working out the last details of, the era of regions as kind of the heart of our common life. Congregational autonomy at each turn has been honored. And each time we have enhanced the structure and tried to improve accountability across our branch of Christianity, and we keep running into incidents that remind us how important some level of accountability is in a truly healthy expression of the Church of Christ. That's capital C in both cases. For Christians to not be accountable and to all be independent seems almost incoherent. And in that, we're in keeping with the patristics, the church fathers and mothers of the first centuries. We can't be totally independent. Campbell said congregations are the core, and I would affirm that. But he also came to understand and preached very strongly, again, in his last couple decades, that the state societies were key to having healthy accountability, especially among the order of ministry. There are some sketchy characters out there who will say, I'm a preacher, listen to me. How can a local congregation, especially in a time before there were public records and internet access, how can we tell when a call is legitimate? How do we honor and educate someone into ministry? And then again, how can we share our resources to effectively witness for the gospel in our county, in our district, in Oklahoma or Ohio? And how can we do projects in the homeland, in home missions, and also overseas or global ministries? These are questions we've wrestled with. And to find that balance between accountability and autonomy is still something we're working on. Our last General Assembly in Louisville looked at changing what had been the International Convention, and since 1968, and restructure has been our General Assembly. But how congregations relate to the wider church, and then how those decisions relate to how we express the good news of God's love made known in Jesus Christ to a world so broken and hurting, it's in need of that healing power. How do we do that effectively? Now, again, we've had two splits. So the a cappella or non-instrumental churches of Christ, they've gone their way, but again, very, very independent. And then we have the independent Christian churches and churches of Christ who kind of slow motion split between 1926 and 1968. 1968 really kind of being a final determination of it's time for us to split. And that split comes about in large part because we said we are going to affirm our cooperative life and a significant role for regions. And the independents essentially have been saying for some time, no, the only God-honored, scripturally supported way to support mission work outside of the local community is still church by church, independent congregations. I think it's inefficient, but they've shown their own effectiveness in many ways. And I'm not here to critique them, simply to say they made their choice to emphasize independence. We've made ours to seek cooperation as we also prioritize Christian unity. So let me jump back into our history to finish illustrating how our history got us where we are. I've talked a little bit about Alexander Campbell and that printing press and that franking privilege that gave us the name Bethany, West Virginia. Those were high-tech choices in his day. We continue to wrestle with how technology can help us share the gospel. And in fact, I think if you look candidly at our history, we have had a history of being early adopters, of getting out there to use the best tools our culture has available to communicate and to use those to communicate the gospel. We might have fallen behind in that in some ways in the last 50 years, but there's room for improvement. We also have had our struggles, as have many American mainline church groups, with how well and then ultimately how effectively we will include minority voices in the wider perspective. I've chosen to give you the inside of the Cane Ridge Meeting House. Again, this is not all inside of, but the beginning point for that Cane Ridge revival, which is almost the match which starts the fire burning, which becomes the restoration movement and that powerful witness to Christian unity across wide differences. Barton Stone continues for some time after August of 1801 to be the minister of the Cane Ridge Church, which is no longer Presbyterian, but is Christian only. And in those early years, I have to tell you, the Christian movement, especially under Barton Stone, and as it spread across Kentucky, preached to both whites and blacks together. And it was controversial for doing so. Now, it's true there was still a certain amount of segregation, whether freeborn or enslaved. Colored persons, to use the terminology of the time, were expected to sit in the balcony. And in fact, not too far down the road, there's a place called Midway, Kentucky, where the first, as best as we can tell, truly Black disciples congregation is established, because so many people of color came to hear the minister preach that some more segregationist-minded members of that church hid the ladder. And so there wasn't access to the balcony. And so knowing that there would not be a place for them on the main floor in Midway, Kentucky, the African-American disciples of Christ founded their own church. And there's a whole story that is not well understood, I'm afraid, among many Anglo or Euro-American or white disciples about how the Christian unity message of a simple gospel shared at an open table spread like wildfire and actually spread from Kentucky very, very strongly and quickly down into North Carolina, where the North Carolina region has its own story about how Black and white disciples lived really very separately from each other, but as they grew and eyed each other warily, we have a lot to celebrate about how they ultimately have come together. But their history includes bishops, a term which many white disciples, especially in the North, think, oh, aren't we opposed to bishops' creeds? But there's a different story in North Carolina. And then there are preachers, including, and this is one of the fun challenges for historians, a former slave, now free Black man, who chose to name himself Alexander Campbell. So one of the first great Black preachers in our tradition is named Alexander Campbell. Makes you have to check your notes from time to time to keep track of things. But Alexander Campbell and Alexander Cross become witnesses and preachers and evangelists. And again, there's a whole story to be told about how the restored gospel, how the Stone Campbell movement and restorationism spread among African Americans. One name I want to encourage you to look up on your own if you have the opportunity, even if it's no more than the Wikipedia entry, is a man in the next century named Preston Taylor. Preston Taylor is still a name to conjure with in Nashville, Tennessee. And his leadership after the Civil War and on into the early years of the 1900s in the African American community is inspiring and moving. And quite frankly, again, as a historian, you can get to the point where you're wondering if, like the two Alexander Campbells, is there more than one Preston Taylor? Because Preston Taylor was a preacher, but he was also an undertaker and a banker. And he got into all manner of businesses and investments and using his stature to invite fellow African Americans into the heart of the economic activity of Nashville, Tennessee. Again, his name is still known in that city, perhaps not well enough among disciples. And it's out of his preaching and his organizational efforts that what we still refer to as the National Convocation rises up and becomes a force to be reckoned with in the disciples of Christ. We continue to live and work with slightly separated institutions, but I would say among the disciples of Christ, we have perhaps more people of color involved in our movement than in many similarly situated Protestant bodies in the United States and Canada. So I'm thankful for Preston Taylor and for the convocation and for the witness of African Americans, including, of course, our current General Minister and President, Reverend Teresa Hord Owens. And her presence is a witness to how far we've come. And of course, she's a woman, not the first woman to be our general minister and president. I referred to that final split between independence and we cooperative disciples of Christ with restructure in 1968. Restructure is also when we began having general ministers and presidents, starting with Dale Fires. And we've had our ups and downs with what that office is and how we honor it. Little dispute in Tulsa a few decades ago, some of you might recall. But Sharon Watkins, another female general minister and president, and a person I've known for years and consider a friend. She and her husband, Rick, helped our church understand a great deal about our history out of their respective interests. And Sharon, in her leadership in some very challenging times for the disciples of Christ, handed the reins on to Teresa Hort Owens, two females in a row as our effective senior executive, if not quite chief executive. This gets into the whole question of independence and autonomy. But again, one more time, jumping back to help illustrate where we are now, it was in 1874 that a woman named Carolyn Neville Pear said, we just aren't sending missionaries. The first version, if you will, of the United Christian Missionary Society, our first effort towards global missions, had sent a few missionaries over the next few years following 1849, and then the effort kind of petered out. But it was the women of the church, and especially in places like Missouri and Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, that came together and said, you know what, we're going to take our money, because in the 1870s and 1880s, women were first having access to cash on their own, couldn't vote yet. They were being ordained in places like Ohio and Illinois, but also just everyday women who were committed Christians, worshiping on Sunday, gathering for fellowship through the week, said, you know what, let's put our butter and egg money together. And they put so much butter and egg money together, they started sending missionaries overseas. And the Christian Women's Board of Missions was so effective that the next meeting of the International Convention said, hey, we men better get into this too. And so the Foreign Christian Missionary Society got organized. And again, you can see where all of this independence and autonomy can sometimes have people working, duplicating efforts, occasionally at cross purposes. But it's really out of Carolyn Neville Pear and the butter and egg money and those Christian women's missionary societies that gave us the missionary effort that now has the Stone Campbell movement and our witness for Christian unity active around the world. And there are still international meetings of that wider movement. The global witness, especially in places like Australia and New Zealand, but also incredibly well established in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where that church is no longer a missionary church. In fact, they themselves are sending missionaries, sometimes to the United States. Women's witness in the church have repeatedly called us to faithfulness in global missions, later to racial reconciliation, and continuing on today in a variety of forms. So I do want to make sure I leave some time to answer some questions, and we'll see whether or not we can do this through some live means, or I might get emailed some questions, which I'll create one more video for you to watch. But we come to today, and as I said, since last year, we're in Louisville, we had a General Assembly which approved some new developments where congregational representation is enhanced, and even in between General Assembly years, which will be every 3 years here coming soon, the 2 intervening years will have virtual meetings, but where the congregational representatives can have a voice in how the general church is at work and how the General Assembly witnesses to local congregations to help maintain their faithfulness, to exhort, to encourage, and to motivate them to share this good news that we've been given. A good news which we believe at our Disciples of Christ tradition, we share in a simple and appealing and scriptural way that invites others to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ through eating of the bread, drinking of the cup, and knowing that Christ lives. I believe our witness is still valid and still powerful when we are able to find ways to step aside and let God's power work through us, sometimes around us. Friends, I thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you just some snippets, a quick overview of our history, which I think is shaping us in positive ways, but also can create some challenges, even hesitations, and sometimes handicaps that we do well to be mindful of, so that as we continue to develop and change how we live out our witness as a church, congregationally, regionally, and on the general level with our general units, we will find a way to continue to be a powerful presence for God in the United States and Canada, as you are in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Bless you all. Take care.